Hi, I'm Terry Dunne. I'm Clare Libraries historian in residence. And what I'm going to be talking about in this talk is how we can see the Clare landscape changing through the Ordnance Survey maps, this being the 200th anniversary of the start of the Ordnance Survey mapping Ireland. And I'm going to talk about this using the case study of a particular East Clare townland where you can see a lot of change in the maps over the period from the first map of 1840 to 1915. This isn't the only way we could see Clare's changing landscape mapped in the Ordnance Survey, but this is a particular townland in which you can see a lot of change, and it also speaks to changes that were going on across the county. And what I'm going to talk about is a number of different landscape changes. Firstly, the switch from tillage to pasture. Secondly, the dissolution of the clachons. Thirdly, upland settlement. Fourthly, land redistribution. And finally, conifer afforestation. Now, strictly speaking, conifer afforestation was going on in a later period, mid-20th century, but I added it in there anyways because it's appropriate, because that happens in this particular downland. Now, I don't actually have a map representation for the switch from tillage to pasture. I think you could see it on the maps. You could see it on the maps if one was looking at where the maps recorded mills or corn stores, but that wasn't in this townland. Now, this townland was in the estate of George O'Callaghan, and George O'Callaghan spoke to the what was commonly known as the Devon Commission, or to give it its full title there, evidence taken before Her Majesty's Commissioners of Inquiry into the state of the law and practice in relation to the occupation of land in Ireland. Yeah. And to say, it's better known as the Devon Commission, and what they did is they went around the country and held hearings in 1844. Yeah, so there was a hearing in Scariff in August 1844 that George O'Callaghan spoke at, and he was the owner of the estate that includes the townland we're talking about. And what he was talking about as regards agriculture in that area were crops, which would surprise us now because it's all grassland, and crop rotations involving potatoes, wheat, barley, and oats. And as regards fertilizers, he was talking about lime, stable manure, seaweed, and shell marl. Yeah, so the shell marl would have came from the Shannon, and seaweed seems like an awfully long way to be bringing seaweed, but it was brought. So our first map then of this area is from 1840. And I'm going to show you a bit more of a close-up of that map, okay? Because there's a bit of detail there. If we go back on what would be the left-hand side, you can see a cluster of dark rectangles. Just have greater detail here. Each one of those dark rectangles is a building, yeah? So there's 27 buildings there. Even if roughly half were sheds, that is 12 to 14 houses, and that's not including the houses along the road, yeah? So what that kind of informal cluster of houses was known as is a clachon. Typically didn't have any kind of services or public buildings such as a church or a post office or a shop. Typically appears to be unplanned, yeah, though there may be a planning going on that would be apparent to the people who actually built the houses. Yeah, but it's not, you know, these straight lines of Georgian ordered settlement patterns. Um, would have been associated with some form of communal management of the lands. Yeah, at least there would have been common grazing, perhaps, and periodic redistribution of the tillage plots. Yeah. If you look at the map, there's large open fields around it. Now, if, and there's one other thing I want to say when we go back to, just to skip back to these crops and crop rotations involving potatoes, wheat, barley, and oats. That's all labor intensive. Yeah. So when we skip ahead and we see this little hamlet and we think there's 27 buildings there, be 12 to 14 families, we have to bear in mind that the form of agriculture that's been practiced is labor intensive. So that's where this population is located in the economy, shall we say. Now, if we skip ahead to the 1893 map, yeah, we can see that the little black rectangles signifying buildings are now missing. And there's a whole heap of very regularly formed field patterns where those little black rectangles were, yeah, because the Clachan sometime in the middle or second half of the 19th century ceased to exist, and it was replaced by these very regular field patterns, which was known as stripping the land. Stripping the land or striping the land, I'm not actually sure. And if we skip ahead there now, we can see what it looks like today from aerial photography. So you have these very neat, regular pattern of fields, yeah? And that picture on the left is exactly where we can see on the right from the 1840 map where the little cluster of dwellings would have been, or was, rather. And you can also see the same pattern of fields, of regularly formed rectangular fields in this picture, which is looking down on where the little hamlet would have been and where it was replaced by this field pattern. It's looking down on it from the adjacent ridge. Now, just to get your bearings here, you have to think of, there's a long, low ridge, glacial till, probably an esker or a moraine. I can't quite tell the difference between an esker and a moraine, but they're formed by glaciers during the Ice Age. You're looking down at a little bit of a valley where those regular field patterns were put in the mid or late 19th century, as we can tell from the contrast between the 1840 map and the 1893 map. And then in the distance, you're going up into the mountain, yeah? And I hope that picture gets you to get your bearings somewhat. Now, I say that this change happened sometime in the mid to late 19th century, as we can see from the difference between the 1840 map and the 1893 map. But actually, we know from the O'Callaghan estate papers that it was happening in the early 1840s. So this type process where Clachan is broken up and replaced by individual holdings, sometimes large individual holdings, sometimes not. So obviously often associated with the famine, but this case was happening before the famine. And in other cases, there would have been a Clachan right into the 20th century. So anyways, yeah, ridge, valley, mountain, there to get your bearings. And And another, um, just talking chronologically, another process that's ongoing in this townland, which is possibly associated with the breakup of the Cunningham, um, is upland settlement. Yeah. So as I said, there was that kind of mountainy bit, and you begin to also see in the difference between the 1840 map and the 1893 map, more houses up in the more mountainy area. Yeah. And if you go back to the Devon Commission that I started with, um, George O'Callaghan and also other people speaking to the Devon Commission are talking about how there's the potential for what they called improvement in the mountainy areas, um, especially when new roads were being constructed and those roads allowed the importation of lime into the mountains. And there's also a section of the estate papers, which I'm just going to read out here now, where there's a note in the estate papers in the rent ledger that's recording the rents paid by the people in this townland, as to the improvement of the mountain, or improvement as they were called. And the mountain has ever since improving and will be found when the lease expires upon the death of John Wall to contain a very large portion of arable and pasture. And I have no doubt that the farm is worth £250 a year. Okay. Now, when you look at where the houses were located in the mountain area, I mean, it's what we might call, and what we're looking at there, the greener parts of the mountain. And you can see some of the old field patterns in that photo as well. Of course, I mean, we might ask what came first. Are those parts of the mountain where the houses were located that bit greener because they picked out the areas that had the better soil types, or are we seeing something that to some degree was shaped by humans, in that we're seeing, when we see the greener bits of the mountain, are we seeing the product of them fertilizing the land and liming the land over and working it over a period of many decades, or is it in fact a mixture of the two? Now, if we go to the 1915 map, we see another change again. Yeah. And in the ridge that you see at the top left corner, yeah, there's a new pattern of regular field boundaries. Yeah. So what we're seeing on these maps by the time we get to 1915 is we're seeing a very regular rectangular field pattern in the middle of what you see on the screen there, which are fields that were put in by the estate in the middle of the 19th century and are what came after a clock was broken up. And on the top left corner, yeah, we see another set of new regular rectangular field patterns. Yeah. What's that about? Okay. Well, they're there because the O'Callaghan estate, or large portions of it, were redistributed under state intervention in the early 20th century. Yeah. Which would have been done either by the Congested Districts Board or the Estates Commissioners. And we can see, if I move on to another picture now, we can see it a little bit more clearly. Yeah. So what we're looking at in the foreground here is the site of the Clochán, which is on the 1840 map. Yeah. And you can see a bit of exposed stone wall there. Yeah. So there would have been houses there, and we can imagine that the houses were cannibalized to make these new stone walls that were introduced by the estate. And then in the background on that long, low ridge, we also see we also see a regular pattern of fields. This is what was introduced in just in the run up to the First World War, and that's by this process of land redistribution and state intervention on the O'Callaghan estate. And they're the new fields we see in the 1915 map. And we can see them here from an adjacent townland. Again, we see these along the long, low ridge. It now has this regular field pattern. Yeah. So two different field patterns that we can see introduced in the mapping, but from very evidence of very different processes and introduced at different times. And then finally, in the mid-20th century, and this is true across the Slieve Burna and the Slieve Ochty, and you see a lot of conifer afforestation. Now, this conifer afforestation doesn't show up in the maps I'm talking about, but I thought I'd mention it. Anyways, because this very particular townland happens to have an example of it as well, and it was an important landscape change in Clare's modern history. And so one of those houses, what I was referring to earlier, the new houses in between the time of the 1840 map and the 1893 map in the upland area, as this upland settlement is taking place, is located in the far distance there, what is now a conifer plantation, or recently cleared conifer plantation. So that was all just one example of how you can see a changing landscape through the Ordnance Survey maps, which are available for everyone to view on GeoHive or heritagemaps.ie. And this is just what I'm talking about here does reflect changes that were going on across the county as a whole, but in other townlands you could see other changes as well. Thanks for listening.